So in 2009, the one that I did, I think I titled From Scotland to America. Here we are 15, 16 years later. Now we're going to do From Ulster to Pennsylvania, and in 2040 I'll be back for Pennsylvania to North Carolina. That is my hope. I have been doing my research chronologically. I started with Scotland and then Ulster and then Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Tennessee, and ultimately out to Illinois. My focus has always been on the local history and the historical background in the community. And how did our ancestors fit in? How did they relate? How did they relate? Not just the relationships between Uncle so-and-so and this family's related to that, but how did they survive as a community? So first off, let me say thank you to Jay and Diane for hosting me last night and tonight, and to Diane in particular for all the research that she's done putting together the Paisley newsletter. I find it invaluable. She comes up with stuff that just is fantastic, and she's been a great sounding board for me too when I come across some research issue that's got me stumped, and we'll exchange emails and try to solve the crime, which is why I like genealogy so much. It's like always trying to solve a mystery. So, from Ulster to Pennsylvania, I wanted to start with just a brief overview of Pennsylvania so y'all can understand when our ancestors came here in the early 1700s, there had only been civilization for about 50 years, probably not even that. In 1681, all of Pennsylvania was just barren wilderness. There were indigenous people living here, but there had been virtually no settlements. There were straggling Swedes and Dutchmen that had shown up on the rivers, but pretty much it was just forest. So this was the original colony of Pennsylvania that was granted by the British King Charles II, to William Penn by a charter. Basically, William Penn became the owner of all of that land and had the right not only to parcel it out and sell it or lease it, but to create the government. So he was the government. He was essentially the king of Pennsylvania. Unlike the other colonies, most of which were royal charters, meaning that they had a governor who answered to the king. They were part of the empire. This was called proprietary colony. It also was one of the last colonies. I'm going to just pop up real quick. First one is Virginia, Massachusetts. You can see these were early on. In fact, Virginia was colonized originally at the same time as Ulster was by the Scots. So at the same time as our Paisley ancestors were going to Scotland, the English were coming over here to Virginia. That's when all of this started. And just quickly, 1632, Maryland, then Connecticut, then New York, then New Jersey, then New Hampshire. 1681 was Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania at the time was completely landlocked. It did not include the Delaware colonies. So in 1682, William Penn divided his colony into 3 counties, made Philadelphia its capital, and established a frame of government, essentially the Constitution for the colony and the colonists and settlers to come. The following year, he continued to keep peaceful relations with all the Indian tribes, and he physically came here, entered into treaties himself with the various tribes, acquired their rights. Wasn't such a good deal for the Indians, but he acquired their rights. And then he returned back to England, leaving Thomas Lloyd in charge. Thomas Lloyd becomes a player later on in this. A couple years later, he set up a number of manors, basically large, just like feudal manors, just like the old, the lord in the castle. There was the same concept at the time. And 2 of the larger ones were a 60,000 acre manor called Gilbert's Manor, and then one that becomes important to our family, which was the Williamstat Manor, which was 7,500 acres, more or less. Those were both on the Schuylkill River. And the 60,000 acre tract was sold to a land investment company from London. And they just kind of sat on it and held it as an investment. It didn't get developed for a very long time. 10 years went by, and in 1701, a new constitution or charter of rights was adopted that guaranteed religious freedom. And that was what triggered settlement and people moving to Pennsylvania. A couple years later, Penn also acquired the Delaware counties, and now we finally had access to the ocean. This is what Philadelphia looked like in 1702. This is where our ancestors landed. AI I thought was a bunch of hype, artificial intelligence, but I ran this through an AI program to colorize it. Look at that, is that amazing?
Wow.
There are a couple things I want to point out about Philadelphia at the turn of the century, right before our ancestors came. The original settlers here dug caves into the embankment and lived in the embankment. You'll notice that virtually there were no wharfs. Everybody would have, the shipping that would come in would have to anchor out in the Delaware. But the main thing is, this was it. I mean, there were a couple thousand people there at most, 2,000. Everything else was undeveloped. Way back here is the Schuylkill River that joins into the Delaware about over here. Our ancestors settled up there. So who were our original immigrant ancestors? We probably all know this. William Paisley, who some of the documents I found, he was referred to as Will, and his wife, Eleanor McLean, Nellie. This is what ties all of us together. And if you think about it, if it hadn't been for that relationship, none of us would be here. Okay, we had a couple original early clues that come from source documents or people that were far enough back in time to be authoritative in what happened. I'm just going to run through them real quick. You probably know most of these already. The first three I'm going to put up here come from the Reverend Samuel Paisley letter from 1850. He was the grandson of Will Paisley and Nellie McLean. And he said that they lived in County Tyrone, got married in 1736 or 37. Soon after, they immigrated to this country, settled on the Schuylkill River about 20 miles above Philadelphia on rented land. Virtually all of that has proven to be true. There's a reason for the 1736 or 1737 though. In those days, they used a different calendar before 1850. The first of the year was March 25th. So if you were talking about the time period between January 1st and March 25th, that was what we would consider the prior year. So if they settled in that time frame in Philadelphia, sometime, say January 1st to March, in the springtime or the late winter, there was confusion amongst later people as to was that 1737 or was that 1736? And it carries on elsewhere in Reverend Paisley's letter. He talks about the first child that was born was Jane in 1737 or 1738. It's the same thing. That comes into play later when I'll discuss briefly the ships that came across and which one I think they were on. The next big clue from Reverend Paisley's letter is grandfather William Paisley had several brothers and sisters, but one other only came to this country, period. We've all assumed, because subsequent researchers have then substituted right after here, that that was the brother John. But this was the original letter. Those other comments were added in subsequently. Grandfather William had several brothers and sisters, but one other only came to this country. I believe he's meaning Pennsylvania. His brother John settled in Delaware, said to be an excellent man whose children amounted to nothing. That was sorry about those of you that come from that line. But that was some 20 odd years later that he came. And why am I making an issue out of this? It's because we've discovered that Mary Paisley came with William. And that's, I believe that this sentence is actually referring to two different individuals. Grandfather William Paisley had several brothers and sisters, but one other only, Mary, came to this country with William. His brother John settled in Delaware 20 years later, said to be an excellent man. Now, of course, I'm reading into it just like other people have read into it, but the wording that I've got up here came from the original letter. There's a number of different variations of it, and I spent a lot of time years ago unscrambling that stuff. So we'll talk briefly about Mary in a little bit. Grandmother Nellie McLean Paisley had 2 brothers and 3 sisters that came from Ireland and lived in Pennsylvania. Also turns out to be true. Now here's the interesting thing. Diane has recently gotten the DNA testing back from Reverend Ian Paisley's son, Kyle Paisley, in Ulster. And it turns out that we are closely related to that line. Why is that important? Well, Reverend Paisley was a very significant figure in Ulster, in Northern Ireland. He was the founder of one of the original political parties, big deal in the Presbyterian Church there. And consequently, there are about 4 books that have been written about him, and some of the people that have authored those books have delved into his ancestry. And the best quote that I found was from the book called Paisley, 1986. The ancestors of Reverend Ian Paisley, which would also be our ancestors, arrived in the townland of Brackey, just outside 6 Mile Cross, in the first wave, which means early 1600s, of Scottish settlers in the 17th century. So these are the basic clues that everybody had for a long, long time. These were the only clues that anybody had about what took place between Ulster and North Carolina. That's it. That was about it. So let's follow up on it for just a little bit here. This is the Pennsylvania colony that was inhabited in the early 1700s, the late 1600s. This is Philadelphia. This is the Delaware River. The map is 45 degrees off. This is the Schuylkill River. And right up here, that's the 60,000 acre Gilbert's Manor. And that's the 7,500 Williamstat Manor that I referred to previously. 20 miles north of 20 miles up the Schuylkill River from Philadelphia, just like Reverend Samuel Paisley said. I'm now going to just quickly run through a family called the Norris family, because our family was tied to this family through the land. Isaac Norris was an Englishman, was a Quaker, and as a young boy, he moved to Jamaica with his family. In 1692, he'd been sent off by his father to Philadelphia because his father was a merchant in Jamaica and he wanted to establish relations for trade with Philadelphia. So young Isaac went off to Philadelphia. While he was there, a horrible earthquake hit Jamaica and decimated Port Royal, which is where his family lived, and virtually all of them were killed. He learned about that when he arrived because he was en route back from Philadelphia when the earthquake occurred. So he came back to total devastation. His family was dead. He was destitute. And he turned right around and went back to Philadelphia. 1693, in Philadelphia, he married Lloyd's daughter. Now, if you recall from the other slide, Lloyd was essentially in charge of Philadelphia because William Penn had returned. Lloyd was his administrator. So all of a sudden, Isaac Norris went from a destitute orphan to being married to the guy who was king of the land, essentially. He began trading as a merchant. Within 7 years, he had made so much money that he built a mansion in downtown, what was then downtown Philadelphia, became elected to the Provincial Assembly, which was the governing body set up by that charter that I had talked about. And he remained in the assembly for the next 35 years. He became very politically connected. His firstborn son ultimately also served for another 20 years in the assembly, became the president of the assembly for about 15 years. They were at the top of the pinnacle in politics and the merchant trade in Philadelphia. By 1703, they had about 8 ships, and they were trading all across the Atlantic. And in 1704, and this is the reason I'm spending so much time on the Norris family, William Penn gave Williamstat Manor to his son, William Penn Jr., who immediately sold it to Isaac Norris and William Trent to pay off a gambling debt. William Trent, a couple years later, sold his half to Williamstat Manor to Isaac Norris. So Isaac Norris now owns the 7,500 acres called Norriton. It became a township and was renamed Norriton in 1730. In 1735, Isaac Norris died. At this point in time, 7,500 acres, think about how big, that's a huge piece of property. 7,500 acres, there were only 20 families living there. Both, it was a combination of rented and purchased land, but for the most part, they were tenants. After he died, his estate was so mammoth that it went into administration, was tied up in administration, estate administration for several years. So nothing happened in this area during that time period. This also happens to be when our family showed up on the scene. The estate was resolved in 1741, the land was dispersed, and for the most part, Norriton was split up between Isaac Norris's daughter, Debbie, and his third son, Charles. Okay, so that brings us to the side that has been ignored in our ancestry, the McLean side. I went searching for clues from the McLeans and discovered that the first McLeans that showed up in the Philadelphia area, were Archibald and William McLean. This is from the account of, this is from a genealogy put together by the McLean family. And they concluded that these two McLean brothers had arrived from Ireland in 1733. Just to give you a preview, ours got there at the end of 1736. So these guys preceded us. Archibald McLean was born in 1699. William McLean was born in 1702 on the Isle of Mull, Scotland.
Sorry about that.
And then he was married in Londonderry right before they left to come to Pennsylvania in 1733. It turns out that the Major family also was from Londonderry. This was just another confirmation that I found that they came in 1733. And then in researching the Abington Presbyterian Church records in Pennsylvania, I discovered that William McLean was one of the founding members of that congregation, and he became a member in 1736, again preceding our Paisley ancestors' arrival on the scene. This is the membership record from the original church records. Okay, so where do we come from? When the Paisleys first immigrated to Ulster from Scotland, it's my belief, based on a lot of stuff that I talked about in 2009, that they came on a ship that came down the River Foyle and ended up in Strabane or Strabane, which was essentially a colony of the Hamilton family from Renfrewshire. They then, if we believe the Reverend Ian Paisley family, ended up in 6 Mile Cross down here. That's probably 20 miles distance. The current day, if you go over to Ulster and look up Paisley in the telephone book, if there is one around anymore, you'll find that they all live around Dungannon, which is the next one. This is Londonderry, which is where the McLean brothers and the Majors came from when they immigrated. And it was one of only two real ports, the other one being Belfast and Carrickfergus, which was also out of the same bay. So all of the records lump those together. My belief is that while our family may have migrated from Strabane down to 6 Mile Cross, eventually William Paisley ended up back up here in Londonderry with the McLeans. Now, this book is Trade in Strangers it's about 500 pages, and it's the most dense, complete study I've ever seen about the early immigration from Ulster in particular into Pennsylvania. This was an extract that I took out of it when I was trying to analyze trying to figure out which ship they came across in, and whether it was 1736 or 1737. You can see here in 1736, there was a surge in immigration, especially from the northern ports, meaning Londonderry and Belfast. 17 ships. Well, as it turned out, there were two causes for that. One was agricultural, they were having problems agriculturally. People were getting hungry. The economy was not doing all that great. But the other thing is that the leases that were in place were all coming due and expiring and were coming up for renewal. And mostly English landlords were jacking the rents up so high that people couldn't afford to renew the leases. And so their only option was to leave the country, which is why there was such a rush down to the harbors to get on the ships. In fact, there were so many people trying to leave at the end of 1735 and the beginning of 1736 that the authorities closed Belfast Harbor and arrested all of the captains of all the ships that were sitting in anchorage waiting to depart. Because the landlords were afraid that all of their labor force was going to flee and they were going to end up with property that they couldn't harvest.
Mark,
So,
was that part of the potato famine?
no, that occurred in the 1800s.
Okay.
Yeah. So the woman that wrote this book did a complete study. She went through the Pennsylvania Gazette newspaper, Ben Franklin's newspaper, and she clocked in all of the entries and exits of the shipping that came through, and she concluded that there were 17 vessels in 1736, which is the year that our family came, that came from Northern Irish ports, meaning Londonderry or Belfast, and 2 of them came via Newcastle. Well, I had more time on my hands than she did apparently, because I went and read every one of those Pennsylvania Gazette editions for 1736, and it turned out there were 20, not 17, and 3 of them came through Newcastle, not 2. And this is a chronological listing of the 20 ships that came from Northern Ireland in 1736. Now remember, I said that they closed down the harbor in Belfast. They closed it in May. Ultimately, there was litigation. The authorities lost, the captains were returned to their ships, and they all departed en masse. They all landed in Philadelphia on October 14th, except for this straggler, who I'm sure was with the same convoy and just got delayed because the paper only came out weekly, so he might have been the day behind them. All from Belfast. Carrickfergus is essentially Belfast. It takes 2 months to cross the Atlantic in a sailing vessel, a square rigger. So that means that they left in, August 15th? So from May to August, nothing was going on. Meanwhile, all of the other ships that were from Londonderry, I think this guy was a straggler too, not that he escaped the thing. But the thing that I thought was really interesting about this is ships going the other way are trying to avoid hurricane season. So they're either going to leave real early or they're going to leave real late. All of these ships left in May and June in order to cross. I'm pretty sure that the Londonderry Port Authority did the same thing as Belfast and shut down the Londonderry port because there were no ships that left in that time period from Londonderry. These ships here at the bottom were the last ones to go once that embargo had been lifted. And of these ships, the last 3 all stopped in Newcastle. And why is that significant? Philadelphia had the same fear as the people in Ulster, that just like everybody was fleeing from Ulster, all these immigrants were piling into Pennsylvania, and the Quakers who were in charge, remember William Penn was a Quaker, most of his early immigrant people were Quakers, Isaac Norris's family they were Quaker. They controlled the assembly. All of a sudden, here are all these Scots Irish coming in, and they were afraid that they were gonna take over control of the government, essentially. And so they were trying to shut down immigration into Pennsylvania, also in 1736. They did that by enacting a tax on any indentured servants or redemptioner servants that were coming in on the ships. So what did the captains do? They stopped in Newcastle because Newcastle was not subject to the same tax laws. So if the ship had servants on it, whether they were indentured servants or they were redemptioners, meaning that they had already arranged a contract at the other end, rather than just selling their services when they arrived in America, that ship would have stopped in Newcastle. The ones that didn't have passengers that included indentured servants would have gone straight to Philadelphia. So I focused on these three because we know they had passengers. Of those three, the one that came in here landed in Newcastle on November 25th, landed in Philadelphia in the beginning of December. Imagine yourself on a sailing ship. You're going to a new land. You don't really know anybody except your father-in-law's cousin immigrated 2 years earlier. Okay, other than that, you don't know anything about this place you're going to. You don't know anybody there. You've got no connections. What are you gonna do? Just hop off the ship? No. The arrangements between the captains and their passengers was that once the ship reached dock, you had approximately a month that you could continue to live on the ship before you had to get off. Because you had to be able to make connections, you had to find relatives. I mean, you didn't just text somebody back in those days or pick up the phone and call them. You had to figure out where they were, send a messenger, or ride out there yourself in a new land that was bedlam anyway because of so much immigration going on. And so they landed in the beginning of December. They probably got off the ship at the end of December, beginning of January, 1736 or 1737. The one ship that really matches that the best is this last one down here, which was called the St. Andrew. It was a brigantine. Like I said, I spent far too much time reading all the Pennsylvania Gazette editions for 1736. And in the course of doing that, I picked out every single article or advertisement that related to the brigantine St. Andrew. I'm not going to go through all of them. The important thing is a fellow by the name of Matthias Aspden was the one who chartered that ship in 1736 to go from Philadelphia to Londonderry and ultimately to come back to Philadelphia. He went on the ship as the charterer. He wanted to make sure that his goods were being transported and what he was picking up was coming back. He was picking up passengers. How do I know that? Because in January, after they landed in Philadelphia, January 1737, he put this notice in the newspaper, in the Pennsylvania Gazette. To all persons who came passengers on board the St. Andrew from Londonderry to Newcastle and Philadelphia and have not yet paid for their passages, either pay the same or you're gonna get your due. Okay? So we know there were passengers on this ship. We know some of them were indentured servants that were dropped off in Newcastle. Matthias Aspden was a business associate of Isaac Norris. Okay. There's so much to understand from this particular map. Because of the Coriolis effect, of the turning of the globe, the wind patterns always follow a certain circulation. And that circulation here is clockwise in the northern hemisphere. So you can see these dashed lines are wind, and you can see how in the north it's going from west to east, and in the south it's going from east to west. That also causes the currents, as does the rotation of the earth. So the currents are also doing the same thing. These dark lines here This is the Canary current that comes down this way. There's a current that comes across this way. The Gulf Stream comes up here. So both the wind and the currents are circulating like this. Back in those days, the sailing ships were square riggers, meaning they had one course that they could sail, downwind. Not like a sloop, like what or a Hobie Cat, where you can point up into the wind. They had a 90-degree area that they could sail. They could go straight downwind, they could go slightly off-wind this way or slightly off-wind that way. So they had to follow this. They didn't, I did cross the Atlantic from here to here. We came across the Azores, Bermuda, and here, but we were under power. If you were in a square rigger, you had to follow this route. And this was pretty much the only route. You would come down here through the Canaries, through Madeira, the Cape Verdes. If you were going down around the Horn to India, you'd go down that way. If you were coming to South America, you'd come over here. Otherwise, you'd come along here, either come up into the Caribbean or pick up the Gulf Stream and head up into here. This was the way trade took place, and this comes straight from Isaac Norris's records of what they were shipping. From Philadelphia, there was a high demand in Ireland for flaxseed. Wheat, barrel staves, and lumber were also in demand in Ireland, and more importantly, they were in demand in Madeira. So they would load up that stuff here in Philadelphia, primarily from farming, the farms that they owned on that 7,500 acres. They would ship that across to Ireland, pick up passengers, drop off the flaxseed, some of the wheat, barrels, staves, and lumber. From there, they would either go down to Portugal and pick up salt, or they would go to Madeira and pick up wine. Madeira wine, because it's got brandy mixed in it, it can be transported in heat. And so it competed so profitably that the French couldn't sell wine in the Caribbean. All of the wine that was drunk in the Caribbean was Madeira wine. Anyway, they'd go to Madeira, they'd drop off the rest of the wheat, barrels, and lumber. They would pick up wine, or like I said, salt from Lisbon. They'd come around to the Caribbean. Sometimes they would stop in the Caribbean, exchange wine for sugar and rum. Then they would continue on back to Philadelphia, where they would drop off their passengers and the rum, sugar, and salt that they had picked up. This was a continual cycle. So our ancestors left from Londonderry, which is up here, Ulster. This is an artist rendering of what the London Wharf looked like, and it's pretty accurate. I've read several books about Londonderry in that time frame, and they describe it just like this. There was only room for about 3 boats to dock at the wharf. It was a fortress city. It had been under siege about 30 years, well, in 1689, I think it was. And this would be the chaos of everybody on board, because as soon as the wind conditions changed to where they could get down the River Foyle, they had to go. And so if you were scheduled to be on one of these ships, you had to kind of hang out around Londonderry until the weather conditions were correct, because you never knew when you were going to get the call to board and go. So it would be pretty crazy when it was time, when the weather conditions changed. This is a brigantine, which I think of all the different pictures that I've looked at of the sailing ships of that day, this is probably the closest to what the St. Andrew looked like. The brigantines had 2 masts. The foremast was shorter than the backmast. The sails on the foremast were all square rigged. Brigantines had 2 spars. Brigs and Snows had 3 spars. On the back, they had a gaff sail, which allowed them to get a little bit more pointed up into the wind than a brig or a snow or a ship. So here we are in Londonderry. I love PowerPoint. So that's the route that they took. Okay, so who was traveling? Well, this may come as a surprise because Sylvadel Partridge, she said it was John McLean and his wife. That was all she knew. Everybody since then, and I mean everybody, including me, including you probably, Diane, thought it was John McLean. It was not John McLean. His name was Joseph McLean. I can guarantee you that I'm right on that one, and you'll see why in a little bit. I also know that his wife was married because they found his estate records, and that's what her name was in the estate records. Who came with them? Well, they left in 1736. Margaret was then about 21, had married Thomas Major. He came along with them. Like I said before, Major was from Londonderry. Eleanor, our ancestor, about 19, married to William Paisley. Their son John, who ended up in North Carolina years later, would marry Jane Marshall, a neighbor. And Joseph Jr., who was then 11, would ultimately also marry a neighbor, a Marshall neighbor. And then their two young daughters, Mary 9, who would marry a man named Thomas Adams, and Isabella 6, who married Mr. Sterling and then disappeared from the face of the earth. We have no information. She's been impossible for me to find anything out about. Who else was on the boat, though? Mary Paisley, the sister that I mentioned, and probably John. My supposition, and I could very well be wrong, is that Will had enough money to pay passage. McLean had enough money to pay passage for his family. But Mary and John came as redemptioners. They were hoping to sell their labor and work for somebody for 5 to 7 years once they got across, which is why, and that's the thing with stopping in Newcastle. We don't know for certain though, because there's no record of John, who I believe some of you are descended from, until 1753. So did he come earlier, get married, and go back to Ireland, and then come back to claim his wife's inheritance in 1753? I think that's what happened. But it is possible that he didn't come until 1753 at all.
Would they also be called indentured?
It's a different thing. Indentured servants would sign a contract when they boarded the ship in Ireland, and it would say, I agree with you, Mr. Captain, that you can sell my services when we get to the other side to pay my fare. Whereas a redemptioner had somebody on the other side already lined up to buy their services. They didn't have the money, so they were going across, and then once they were on the other side, they had a couple of weeks to get the redemptioner to come redeem their contract, which is where the word comes from.
Was there no passenger list for the ship?
No. I've never run across a passenger manifest for any ship in the 1700s. Early 1700s. Okay, so they arrive in Philadelphia, December of 1736. Here's the ship down here in Philadelphia. Well, what happens? Mary Paisley, this is the first record we have of a Paisley in the Americas. Mary's dated Landy. First month, second day, 1737. That's not what you think it means. This is a Quaker numbering system. That means it was in March of 1737. All right. They landed in December. They got their stuff organized in January. She got married in March. My belief is that dated Landy was also a passenger on the boat. I don't think she had enough time to find a husband and get hitched, but she did have 2 months on board to get to know somebody pretty well. So they were married in the Second Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia, in Philadelphia, which also lines up with the fact that they had stayed on the ship for an extended period of time while Joseph McLean contacted his brothers or cousins, whichever they were, Archibald and William, and said, hey, we're here, can you put us up? The reason I say that is this is where Archibald and William McLean settled in White Marsh Township. And this is the Abington Church where they were the founding members 3 years earlier. And lo and behold, in 1739, David Paisley, son of William Paisley, was baptized at the Abington Church. Okay, so it all ties, everybody's tied together now. We have David Paisley, who subsequent Paisleys didn't even know about, showing up in the early church records in Abington. From there, Joseph McLean leased property on the Schuylkill in Norriton Township. Remember, this is Williamstat, now Norriton, 20 miles from Philadelphia. And that's what I'm gonna call the Indian Creek area, because Indian Creek bisects these two townships. So from here on, things are gonna speed up now in my presentation, but from here on, we're gonna be talking about just that area in the red square, the Indian Creek, Norriton area. I spent even more time than I did reading the Pennsylvania Gazette putting together this map. This started really simply for me. I was interested in trying to plot out the McLean and Paisley lands, which were right here, but it just kept growing and growing and growing. And based on deeds and surveys that I was able to find from the early 1700s, I plotted all of the acquisitions and original settlers in the whole Norriton, West Norriton Township area, and then overlaid topography and contour lines and natural features and things onto the map so that I could understand the relationships geographically between people, places, and important spots. So if you notice, I've got a little tent here, and one here, and one here. Before the white man showed up, there were 3 Indian camps here. These 2 were actually Indian villages. One was at French Creek on the south side of Schuylkill. The other was at Indian Creek, hence the name, Indian Creek, where the creek branched about a half a mile up from the Schuylkill River. And the other was down here at Stony Creek, which ultimately became the center of the community in later years. So the initial settlement of Europeans in the Indian Creek area began in 1722. That was it. Until 1730, those 3 households, the Paulings, Englishmen, the Hayes, and the Armstrongs, these were all English settlers that came, just 3. They all purchased from the Norris family. They purchased directly from Isaac Norris Sr. before he passed away, of course. And then in 1729, the Norrises built a mill down here on Stony Creek. The reason they were able to build a mill there is Norriton extended down this way, and they had already been selling out down here, and this was being developed with farms. So they knew that there was enough supply to feed the mill, and they wanted to market this property, so they needed a mill to market this property. So they built the mill there. And then in the next 3 years, you can see how many more people all of a sudden flocked to the area because now there's a mill. Enough people that they also built a store next to the mill down here. These were also all Englishmen. And then 1735, Isaac Norris died. Everything came to a standstill. It took them several years to sort out the administration. And then once they got that worked out and the sons were administering the estate, they were able to start to sell and lease a couple more. One of those was an Englishman by the name of John Slater, who leased this property here at the forks of the Indian Creek. All of the rest of these people were English except for one, which was the Shannon family over here. They were Irish. And then in 1740, 1742, the Paisleys moved from the Abington church area up into here and settled on this part of the property, which was now owned by Isaac Norris's daughter, Deborah. The Hamiltons settled here and the Marshalls settled here. You recall that the McLeans, two of the boys married the Marshall daughters. And then a second Presbyterian church was formed, the congregation was formed here in 1742, now it's called the Lower Providence Presbyterian. This was the only church in the area prior to that. It's the Norriton Presbyterian Church. Okay, I got here a couple days ago and I spent 2 days in Norriton, Norristown now, and a day or two in the Philadelphia area. And I went around and took pictures. I was able to actually locate exactly where our ancestors settled on these properties. The first group of pictures I'm going to show you was taken from down here near Stony Creek of the Schuylkill River. It's a really beautiful area. That's looking upstream on the Schuylkill. You can see the river's fairly wide here, and there is a decent current here, which was the reason that they put the mill there. This is looking downstream from the same spot. This is the pathway along the riverside, a great biking path, by the way, going up to the other crossing, which was closer to where our family ended up. And this is the other ford called Fatland Ford, which George Washington used for his Valley Forge encampment, which is directly across the river from where our family lived, to cross to attack Germantown. This was the ford. Now you can see here, it's much narrower, it's shallower, and there's almost no current here. I could have walked across there if I had wanted to. And the next group of pictures, I forget what, oh yeah, Indian Creek. I walked up Indian Creek, and it's fairly steep at the bottom, but at the top it flattens out. This is where the Indian camp was. And you can see that it's all flattened in on both sides. They had a source of water. These trees obviously would have been thinned out back in those days. This is a picture looking up Indian Creek. At the fork, it's shallow on this side, but if you went up this fork over here, they've dammed it at the top, and it's about, from the base of the creek to the land adjacent to it, it's about 6 to 8 feet. So it was a pretty deep, powerful creek in its day. This is the Joseph McLean property that he settled. He took over the Slater lease that I mentioned before. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about that in a second. And the next picture, all of those pictures were taken from right here. The next picture is taken from right here, from where the Paisleys settled. It is now a townhome complex. This is looking south with the Schuylkill River being this dark line that you see right in here. After the Paisleys left the property, Deborah Norris's heir acquired title. He built a mansion house on top of where the old log cabin was. The old log cabin, meaning the Paisley log cabin. When they subsequently left and passed away, they established the Norris graveyard near the house. That's why I know that I was in the right place, because that is the Norris graveyard. It was exempted from the townhouse development and still preserved there. I then walked down to the Schuylkill River from the bluff on the end of the Paisley property, and this is the path going down. It probably wasn't too much different back in the day, other than the fact that logs were sawed like that. Now, what were these improvements like that our ancestors first moved into? What kind of cabins did they live in? Across the river in Valley Forge, this is what the soldiers erected to live in. These were temporary shelters. You can see there are no windows, just a door. So this is the same general time period. These are reproductions, but they're historically accurate. I'm not so sure about the shake roof, but the fireplaces were made out of wood. back in the day because there wasn't enough rock in the area for them to make fireplaces, and these were intended to be temporary structures. So most likely, when our family first moved into this area, it was completely woodland. There were no people around, no building materials, nobody to help them. They cut down the trees that they could cut down. They stacked them together into log cabins with no windows. They roofed them as well as they could. They had to have made a fireplace, but on the other side of the river, there was a lot of rocks. So they probably made rock fireplaces. This is a little bit more, this was also taken in Valley Forge just the other day, and this is probably more typical of what our ancestors lived in when they first cleared the land. There would have been stumps all over the place because they didn't have time to mess with that kind of thing. But, and instead of a wood chimney, they would have had a rock chimney. But otherwise, they would have put windows in because they needed ventilation and light since they were living in them full time, as opposed to soldiers who just came and went when they were on parade, you know. This is called the Van Leer Cabin. This is very near Valley Forge on the south side of the river. It's the oldest surviving structure in Chester County from about 1750. This is actually, other than the porch here, that is actually what the cabin looked like. This is most likely almost identical to what the first permanent structure our ancestors built on their property. This happens to be located it was built originally on the property immediately adjacent to a family that David Paisley, one of the sons of William, married into. So we actually have a connection to this cabin, and it's the oldest one still standing. That's the old Norriton Presbyterian church, the stone church. At the time our ancestors were here, it was a log cabin. It was replaced by this in the late 1730s. Okay, we're going to zoom in a little bit now and focus just on our ancestors. This is the property that Joseph McLean leased from Isaac Norris family. This is the property that Paisley's leased. I should say William Paisley and David Landy. Remember, Mary Paisley married David Landy. They jointly leased this property. Both of these leases this one took place in 1740, this one took place in 1737. Deborah Norris actually owned this whole piece. Marshalls are here, Hamiltons are there, who married into the Paisley family. This part here was Charles Norris, her brother, was the owner. So like I said, when I got started on this, my focus was I just wanted to find this and this. That was it. But I found in the Norris files in Philadelphia, a survey. This was the original survey done for John Slater when he entered into a lease in 1731. And I've overlaid it exactly, and I used this as a base to start my sketch. It expanded over time. It just kept bigger and bigger and bigger. But you can see this was the kind of thing that I used to draw this map. For each one of these properties, I did something similar to this. This is from Isaac Norris's property distribution of his estate. This was the map that they used, and right on that map, it was noted that it was leased to John Slater, whose right Joseph McLean bought. Not John McLean, Joseph McLean. They later sold this property, the estate sold it to John Thompson. Now, like I said, this was Debbie Norris's property here. Again, this is from the property distribution map used in the estate proceedings. Hamilton is noted on there. Paisley and Landy noted on there. Marshall is noted on there. All the streams. Indian Creek was entirely on the Paisley and Hamilton property, not on the McLean side. And that is this section over here. And again, William Paisley and David Landy were the tenants. This is from Isaac Norris's ledger book for when Joseph McLean took over the lease of John Slater. He paid £25 for the leasehold improvements, the log cabin, whatever fencing was there, the work of clearing the land and everything else. John Slater started in 1751, but it was just him and his wife and his son. They weren't able to farm this sufficiently to pay the rent that was due to the Norris family, which was 30 bushels of wheat per year. So they continually fell in arrears to the point that by 1737, just 6 years, they were in debt to the tune of 25 pounds, which was a huge sum of money back in those days. My guess is that Archibald McLean, the brother or cousin of Joseph McLean, knew about this because they kind of knew the Norris family as well, and turned Joseph onto it, who came out here and bought out the Slater leasehold. And he did that. He didn't have that kind of money, but what he did was he signed a bond, which is like a mortgage for those leasehold improvements, and then he took over the lease obligation, which was a 21-year lease, to pay 30 bushels of wheat in rent each year. Unfortunately, he had the same problem as Slater did, because just 6 years later in 1742, he went into default. And this is the detail that was down in that section. 1742, September. By cash received of Archibald McLean in full for Joseph McLean's debt and cost of suit for prosecuting the bond, $21. So Archibald McLean from Abington had guaranteed Joseph's obligation to the Norris family when Joseph McLean fell into debt, default. The Norrises didn't look to Joseph, they looked to Archibald, who had a farm of his own, and he was a well-known surveyor at the time. He was well-known through the community. So Archibald came over. He didn't do that out of the goodness of his heart. He did it because they were relatives. Joseph McLean's string of luck continued to be bad. After he was defaulted and kicked off of that leased property, he moved south across the Schuylkill River into Chester County. 2 years later, and he started a farm there. 2 years later, he died. And this is the inventory of his estate, which includes a gun and gun barrel. It was pretty rugged back in those days. And his widow and his 2 sons and daughters moved back to Norriton with their in-laws. Meanwhile, Thomas Major, who was Joseph McLean's son-in-law, took over the lease of that property. This is what it looks like today. Here's the Paisley. That's the location of that Norris cemetery that I showed you, which is where I believe their log cabin would have been. This is the location of Joseph McLean's cabin. He's now surrounded completely by that property's now surrounded by a golf course. This one's surrounded by townhomes. That tells me something that I've suspected, which is that this property really was better situated, which is why it was able to be farmed successfully, whereas this one, which was cut by 2 streams and had a bluff and a weird contour, was probably more difficult to farm. So this one was never productive, and in fact, it's still not productive. It's a golf course instead of Okay, so here we are in 1740s. We've got a farm going. You're cultivating the land, cutting down trees, clearing things, raising animals and crops, and starting a family. So throughout the 1740s, the family starts to grow. This is the one I descend from. I'm guessing that most of you descend from William. That one ultimately became Colonel John. Margaret, Mary. And then in 1750, probably in childbirth, Eleanor died, and William remarried Catherine Hamilton. Remember, the Hamiltons leased the property immediately north of them. So what happened between 1750 and 1760? Couple things. Like I said, Eleanor died and we were remarried. John Paisley, William Paisley's brother, arrives from Ireland. He had married Margaret Gray, whose father, John, I think it was John Gray, was a shoemaker in Dover, Delaware. He had died with property and his estate was being contested. He had been notified that there was a claim being made and that if his wife wanted her share, because she was supposed to get half of the property, half of the estate, they better come to Ireland. So he and his wife came to Ireland and they landed in 1751. Like I said, I think that John had actually come earlier in 1737 and met the daughter, got married, didn't like it in America, and went back to Ireland. And what brought him back again to America was this inheritance. Unfortunately for him, he didn't have a great string of luck either, and in 1761 he died. We know that because we found the estate administration records, but also this is the tax roll from 1761, and you can see John Paisley, and then they struck his name from the tax roll. Here's something that I just figured out this morning, and this is going to throw a monkey wrench in a bunch of people's thoughts on Brother John and his family. His wife, Margaret Gray Paisley, died in March of 1765. There's a private John Paisley who, in his pension application, said that he was orphaned and raised by his Uncle Will a mile from Indian Creek. Uncle Will had moved to North Carolina in late 1764. John would have still been with his mother, who didn't die until March of 1765. So either John is not related to John and Margaret, or he was making something up. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but she should not have died then. She should have died 5 years earlier. She messed up. Anyway, we've got time to figure that one out. 1751, the two McLean brothers married the two Marshall daughters back in Norriton. And then in 1753, William Paisley signed a petition to have a new road built. This is the only known signature of William Paisley, our immigrant ancestor. And one of the things that you can tell from this is he was not illiterate. I mean, I've seen a lot of signatures on these old documents over the years, and a lot of it looks like chicken scratch when people could sign. Most people just signed with an X. But this is a very flowing signature, and it's just on a road petition. I mean, look at some of the other signatures are nothing to write home about. So this tells me that they were not the lowest class of immigrants when they came here.
And was that spelling
Paisley. All of the records in Pennsylvania are spelled P-E-A-S-L-E-Y. The word Paisley only shows up when they move to North Carolina.
Do we know why that is?
Paisley. How do you say that? Paisley. It was the brogue, the Irish brogue. Whoever wrote it down, but the family, they called themselves Paisleys. In America, it was converted to Paisley. Now, whether that also, I mean, does that mean that we aren't from Paisley? No,
Right.
I don't think so. I think that it was the same thing at the other end too. They bastardized the language and it went from Paisley to Peasley and then went from Peasley back to Paisley.
Well, a lot of people who went to Ellis Island had the same thing happen to them.
Absolutely.
I mean, Russian names became Americanized.
Yep.
Totally.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, big event then happened in 1754. We as Americans never really focused on the French and Indian War because that was fought by the British. We didn't come around until 20 some odd years later. This was the First World War, literally the First World War. there were battles fought all over the globe. India, the Caribbean, Europe on the continent, all over America, all through Canada, and it was fought between the French and the English. In America, it was, oh, by the way, in Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War. It ran from 1754 to 1763, which by my count is 9 years. But they can't spell, I can't add. So anyway, here we call it the French and Indian War because the French allied themselves with Indian tribes. In fact, the only Frenchmen in the colonies, you know, in Pennsylvania colony at the time, were in far western Pennsylvania at the forks of the Allegheny in what's now Pittsburgh, and it was called Fort Duquesne. The French had established a fort there. Other than that, there were a couple traders and fur, you know, and hunters wandering up and down the rivers. But besides that, there was virtually no French settlement, no French presence at all, other than at Fort Duquesne, at the forks of the Allegheny. Their Indian tribes all roamed around. The British figured that in the beginning, that what they were going to do was to defeat the French. All they had to do was take over that fort, lay siege to the fort, drive the French out of the fort. They would be gone from America. Maybe you'd have to deal with them up in Canada, but that was somebody else's problem. So in 1754, they launched an offensive out of Virginia under General Braddock, who built a road out to Fort Duquesne and got himself ambushed on the way. George Washington was his right-hand man, by the way. And in fact, George Washington was the reason the whole French and Indian War started. That's another story. And so they were driven back. General Braddock was killed. British troops, just in total disarray, rushed back to Virginia, chased by the Indians. They were slaughtered the whole way back. And the Indians now, because they were on the offensive, went all up and down the mountains, slaughtering all of the settlers, most of whom were German at the time. In particular, up in the northern part of Pennsylvania, in Berks and Bucks County, which is around Bethlehem, where there was a Moravian settlement, just like there is in North Carolina. In fact, it's the same group of people that migrated down there. In 1754, 1755, 1756, they were just killing, the Indians, mostly Shawnee, were just killing anybody that was in the mountains. Almost all of those settlers at that time were Germans. The Irish had not settled in that area. They went down into Lancaster County and then down to Frederick, Maryland. The Germans went north into Philadelphia, Bucks and Berks County, and that's where the massacres were taking place. I mention that because the story of Deliverance Payne, whose family was slaughtered by the Indians, and she was sold for a bottle of rum and a loaf of bread to Reverend James Davenport. It's my belief that her parents were German Moravians. That's why she never spoke about the slaughter or her family or her parents, because she didn't speak English. As a young child, she probably said very, very little because it was a foreign tongue to her, living with the Davenports. At any rate, while this was a very violent war out in the mountains, in Philadelphia and even in Norriton, there wasn't much going on, other than the fact that troops and supplies were being fed out to Braddock. In 1958, however, the British launched a second offensive under General Forbes, who came across with Highlander regiments, and they, along with Pennsylvania Army, not militia, but Army, went out a second time, which I'll get to at the very end of the presentation, because one of our relations was in those battles. Okay, 2 years after the French and Indian War began, the Reverend Benjamin Chestnut came to Norriton and became the minister of the Norriton Presbyterian Church and of ultimately the Lower Providence Presbyterian Church, which united those two congregations. They had split apart back in the 1730s and 1740s due to a schism between the religious beliefs of the congregations in those days. That's a very long story, which I'm just going to avoid today. At any rate, Benjamin Chestnut leased property immediately adjacent to the Hamiltons, a half a mile from the Paisley family. which is why Will Paisley Jr. met Deliverance Payne, because she was a boarding student at Benjamin Chestnut's school. Benjamin Chestnut and Reverend James Davenport were religious colleagues. They had both served at the Hopewell Church in New Jersey, which is where they met. Which is why when Davenport died, his widow sent Deliverance Payne to board and go to school with Reverend Chestnut. They knew each other. Okay. In 1756, I forgot this part. Shortly after William Paisley and David Landy leased that property next to Joseph McLean, David Landy, who it turns out was a shoemaker, not a farmer, he split and he bought 50 acres south of the river up in the hills and moved there. But in 1754, he sold that land to Joseph McLean Jr. and moved back to Norriton. And then 2 years later, he died. Now, the reason that I have this on here as a significant event in this decade is in the estate proceedings for David Landy, it turns out that the witnesses to his will, David Landy signed, sealed, published in front of the presence of us, Benjamin Chestnut, Thomas Major, and William Paisley. So this document ties together those four men. Thomas Major was married to Eleanor McLean's sister. William Paisley was married to Eleanor McLean. David Landy had sold his 50 acres in Chester County to Joseph McLean Jr., which was Nellie McLean's brother. Reverend Benjamin Chestnut was the minister and neighbor of all of these people. So here's everybody tied together in a single document. And so in 1754 or 1756, we know that all of these people were right here together and that they were all in communication with each other on a regular basis. 1758, William Paisley's son David enlists in the army to go fight in the French and Indian War. We have more to say about him in a little bit. And then in 1758, also Deliverance Payne arrived at Reverend Chestnut's school, which we just talked about. Okay. So from 1760 to 1765, these are all of our significant ancestors. Hopefully you can see this. I know it's pretty. Try something here. Okay. So from here over is the first generation of immigrants. William Paisley and Eleanor McLean. The blue signifies that they were in Norriton Township. Nellie's brother John, who married Jane Marshall, they moved to North Carolina early. There are very few records until they ended up in North Carolina. He did fight in the French and Indian War, however, and probably moved shortly after he was discharged. Joseph McLean Jr., who is the one that bought David Landy's 50 acres in Chester County, he is in Chester County. That's what this signifies. Thomas Major, who married Mark McLean, who was Eleanor McLean's older sister, was in Norriton. Thomas Adams, who married Mary McLean, the other sister of Eleanor and Margaret, is also in Norriton. This side now is the next generation. These are William and Eleanor's kids until we get to here. We have John Paisley, the colonel, married Marianne Denny. He's living at home with his parents until they ended up moving to North Carolina. Robert Paisley, my ancestor, who married Margaret Major, the daughter of Thomas Major. also living in Norriton until he went to North Carolina. Jane Paisley, their eldest child, Will and Nellie's oldest child, Jane, married John White. He was living in Chester County. They moved to Chester County and show up in the tax returns in 1763 and 64, I think that is there. Will Paisley Jr., he was in Norriton. I believe he then became an apprentice to a fellow by the name of William Sharp in Chester County to learn cooperage, making barrels. He shows up in the Chester County tax rolls in 1763 as a free man, meaning he was single. And then the rolls exist for the following year, but he's not there. And the reason is, and what these two squares signify is, he had gone to Philadelphia to get married to Dilly Payne. And I know that, that's the reason he's not in the tax rolls that year. I know that because I found the county court records where they specifically say that he was originally assessed and then stricken from the tax roll in September because he was absent from the county. And then we have the license and the marriage records in Philadelphia from, I think it's November of that same year, where he and Dilly got married. Dilly got married. This was when Jane Paisley and John White got married. David Paisley, who it turns out was the eldest son, married Margaret Sharp, whose father was William Sharp, who was a cooper. David Paisley became a cooper. He was apprenticed to William Sharp, which is why I think that Will Jr. also ended up being an apprentice there, because later we find out that Will Jr. was also a cooper, a barrel maker. David Paisley shows up as an inmate in Chester County in 1761. An inmate is somebody who's married but is living on someone else's property or in their household, meaning they're living either with an in-law or with an employer. In this case, it was both, an in-law who was an employer. He showed up again in 1763, also as an inmate, and then he shows up for the last time in Chester County here. William Sharp, of course, was living in Chester County that whole time. Let me see if I can get this back. There we go. Okay, so Will and Eleanor moved to North Carolina at the end of 1764. They took their children who were not married with them, which would have been John and Robert and the two youngest daughters. We know that they end up in North Carolina. There are property records and marriage records in 1768, 69, and 70. John McLean was already in North Carolina. Joseph McLean, the one who had bought the 50 acres in south of the river from David Landy, he stayed there until 1769, moved to Maryland for about a year or two, and then ultimately moved to North Carolina. We know this because he sold that 50 acres to someone else in 1770, and on the deed it says Joseph McLean of, and then it gave the town, Back River Township, Back River Hundred, I think they called it, Cecil County, Maryland. So he was no longer there. So these locations are pretty much for sure. Thomas Major and Margaret McLean stayed in Norriton. They showed up on the tax rolls in 1767, 1769, 1773. They continued staying in Norriton, and through the American Revolution in 1783, they moved to North Carolina as well. Thomas Adams and Mary McLean, the other sister, they stayed in Norriton. Again, they show up on the tax records in Norriton in 1767 and 69, and in 73. And then I have the estate records. He died at the end of 1773. John Paisley, the son, went with his father and family, got married down here in 1769 to Marianna Denny, was in North Carolina. Robert Paisley, my ancestor, moved to North Carolina, bought property in Orange County, North Carolina, bought another there was another real estate transaction in Orange County, North Carolina. He returned back to Norriton, where he married Margaret Major, his cousin, daughter of Thomas Major. And then they turned around sometime in 1769 and moved back down to North Carolina, where we have other records that I didn't bother to put on here. I believe that along with Robert and Margaret in 1769, the John White and Jane Paisley also moved to North Carolina because they no longer show up in the tax rolls in Charleston in Chester County. And also that William Jr. and Deliverance Payne also moved with them to North Carolina, because the tax records for William Jr., like I said, he showed up as single in Chester County when I believe he was there as an apprentice learning the cooperage trade. He then shows up in the tax records in Charleston after he got married. So he finishes his cooperage apprenticeship. He goes to Philadelphia, gets married. He's not going to come back and move back in now that he's got a wife with his master. So instead, where does he go? He goes to Charleston, where his sister and brother-in-law are living, and settles over there, which is why he shows up as a regular taxpayer instead of as a free man in Charleston the following year, because he's now married. Sometime then, he gets a call from his brother David to come help farm in Norriton, which this is a story all in and of itself. So let me finish with William. He's in Chester, he's in Norriton, he goes to apprentice, he goes to Philadelphia, gets married, comes back to Chester, goes to Charleston Township, lives by his sister and brother-in-law, and then migrates with his brothers and his sister to North Carolina in 1765. Oop, I'm sorry, skip that. He doesn't migrate then. He goes back to the Norriton farm and takes over part of the farm, where he shows up on the tax records as a cooper in 1767, and then shows up again in 1769, and then moved in 1769 with the rest of them down to North Carolina. Okay, David Paisley, who was actually the oldest son, he shows up in the tax records in Chester County as an inmate, meaning he's married. He got married in 1760 to William Sharp's daughter after he was discharged from the army from the French and Indian War. He shows up again as an inmate, meaning he's living in someone else's house with his wife, also in Chester County. But he does not show up in that county in 1764, which, where did he go? Well, 1764 in the fall is when Robert moved to North Carolina. But the lease remained in Robert's name. I mean, in William's name. And so somebody had to be farming the property. Well, most of them had gone to North Carolina. The rest of them lived over in Charleston Township in Chester County. The only one who isn't spoken for is David, and he's not on the tax rolls anywhere, and there were no tax rolls for the year 1764 or 65 for Norriton. So it's my belief that David, after he had finished his apprenticeship, gotten married, served in the army, came back, all of his relatives were leaving, the farm was still there, the family was obligated on the lease, that David moved back and took over the farming in Norriton. But it didn't work out for him. One of the reasons that I think that he was in Norriton at the time was in 1765, his father-in-law, William Sharp, died, and David showed up at the auction, meaning he was nearby. He showed up at the auction and he bought a cow, a servant, an indentured servant, a gun, a bed, and a dough bowl. In fact, he was the largest bidder at the auction, besides William Sharp's eldest son, Thomas, who bought all the farming equipment and then moved onto the property and farmed the William Sharp property. Well, where did David Paisley go and what did he need? A cow, a gun, a dough bowl, a bed, and a cow for? My belief is all the livestock had been taken with the clan when they went to North Carolina. He needed to protect himself, he needed sustenance, he needed a cow, he needed a bed, all the things that he needed if somebody had vacated the Norriton Paisley plantation. And so I believe that he stayed there in Norriton, tried to farm, called his brother William, who was living across the river in Charleston, said, hey, I need some help, come on back here. And that William Jr. came back to Norriton, they farmed together. And after just a short period of time, David said, you know, I've had enough of this. I'm a cooper. I'm heading down to Baltimore because they've got a real demand for coopers right now down there. And off he went to Maryland. He shows up in Maryland, in Baltimore in 1768, I think it was. 1767 and 1768, they're two different records. One signing a petition, the other is the daughter being baptized in the Presbyterian Church in Baltimore. We know that William Jr. shows up in the tax records in Norriton in 1767 and 1769. So to me, the only thing that makes sense about what happened to the Paisley farm is this, that David and William farmed it for a short time. David said, forget this, I'm gonna go down and build barrels. You stay here and farm, which he attempted to do. And William shows in the tax records as also being a cooper. So they were probably trying to do both on the Norriton farm. Run a cooperage and farm the 200 acres and just had a party of the ways. David then stayed in Baltimore until, thanks to Diane's research, we discovered that he moved to Kent, Delaware, Kent County, Delaware. 1772, if I recall, 1773. In 1776, he joined the Continental Army and went off to war again, which I'm going to get to in a minute.
All these
So-
movements to North Carolina, is North Carolina the new frontier at this point?
Yes. And the Moravians, the Germans from the Bethlehem area in Lancaster also, they had been going down there building Salisbury, building a community down there. And so the path was being blazed. There were family connections. There were gun makers in both places. So they were defending, you know, they themselves were pacifists, but they were supplying their neighbors with guns to defend them. Much like the Quakers were doing with the Scots Irish defending them in the French and Indian War. In fact, in the company that David Paisley enlisted in, I think he was one of only a handful of Scots Irish. Half of the enlistees were German and the other half were English. And they were all indentured servants. And the reason that they enlisted, other than David Paisley, but almost everybody else in this company enlisted because they were indentured servants. And there was legislation passed that said that if you joined up, your bonus money could be used to pay off your indenture. So, okay, this is one, back on that other one that all of these notations that I have here, wherever you see something written, there's either a deed or a tax roll to back that up. Mostly it's tax rolls. This is a typical tax roll from that time period. The 1769 tax rolls for Philadelphia County, which is where Norriton is, have been known for 100 years. They're in the Pennsylvania colonial records. And they're indexed really well. You can find anybody there. Nobody ever even knew the 1767 records existed. I don't know why, but I've had the strangest dumb luck of stumbling onto these documents when I've been in the archives going through different things. And I'll be looking at somebody's journal and all of a sudden I'll flip the page and there's something totally unexpected on the next page that people have been looking for, and you know, it's misfiled or it's in some book that's locked away in some cabinet nobody ever sees. I stumbled upon the 1767 tax rolls. It's some collection at some foundation somewhere online. I don't even remember how I found it, but if you search in Ancestry or in the LDS church records, they don't have these. There's one place, I have a link for it if anybody's interested in looking at this stuff, but, so this is the 1767 tax rolls, and this is not pages side by side. These are two different townships. This is the one on the left here is the Philadelphia South Ward, which is in Philadelphia town, and this is the Norriton Township. And the reason that I have these two pages next to each other is this was the assessment for Debbie Norris, who was the landlord, and these people were all tenants. These are occupants on the ground, but if you had a debt owed to you, you also had to be taxed, you were taxed on it. And so this connects Debbie Norris directly to her tenants. Thomas Major, Thomas Adams, and William Paisley. Cooper, it says. Now something else to notice is Thomas Major and Thomas Adams both have numerous horses, cows, sheep, Thomas Major has a servant. Whose servant is that? Who was that? Remember David Paisley went down to Baltimore and he had bought his father-in-law's servant? He didn't need it if he was just going to be a cooper in Baltimore working for somebody else. But there was one less man to work the fields. So he probably sold his servant to his uncle, which is why the servant appears there. These others were just other tenants on the property. One of them, John Redinger, shows up in 1769 as well. Over here, besides the amount assessed, there's also the basis for that assessment. And this is what it says. 60 bushels of rent from Thomas Major of Norriton, which is worth 16 pounds, 10 shillings. 80 bushels, 80 bushels, 70 bushels, 10 bushels. Well, you can calculate, because we know the rate, you can calculate what that converts into an acreage, which I did. Thomas Major's 60 bushels equals 150 acres. William Paisley Sr., isn't that odd? He's not there anymore. He's in North Carolina. This is 1767, but William Paisley Sr. and William Paisley Cooper, Jr., both show up in Debbie's assessment. 70 acres and 175 acres and 25 acres, and we know that his lease originally was 200 acres. Well, 25 acres is not a sufficient size to run a farm in those days. I mean, there was a forest, you girdled the trees and cut them down, left them where they lay, planted around them with an ox or a horse-drawn plow. You know, you planted where you could. It's not like, you didn't have fertilizer, you didn't have irrigation. 25 acres was not enough to survive on. He was a cooper. That's how he was making his living. These other guys needed 200 acres, 150, 175 acres. They were farmers. Okay, so, but William Paisley wasn't there. But remember, that just relates back to the rent. Who was actually there? Thomas Adams, the son-in-law. So Thomas Adams took over the bulk of William Paisley's lease after David went to Baltimore and William Jr. said, I'm not going to farm it either, I'm just going to be a cooper. And that's why the lease is split up the way that it is. Okay, now I took this page from 1767 and I moved it over here. Now we have the same page for 1769. And you can see that these people are still basically the same. Thomas Major still with a bunch of horses and a servant. The only thing missing now is the servant. We don't know where he went to. Thomas Adams, bunch of cows, horses, sheep, same thing here. William Paisley Cooper, now it just says William Paisley, but it's still, he just has one horse. He's obviously not farming anything. just because it doesn't say Cooper the second time around doesn't mean he wasn't a Cooper anymore. It just means that they didn't bother to put it on the assessment because you weren't actually taxed on that. It was just an expression like junior or farmer, something to that effect. Okay, that brings us to the end, which I wrote about a 200 and some odd page book called The Life and Times of David Paisley. And that is David Paisley, the eldest son, who was missing from all of everybody's research until I stumbled upon him in this process. When he joined the Pennsylvania Army in 1758, one of the things that I'm sure enticed him, besides the bonus that he was going to get and the pay that he was going to get, was they were known, I mean, they made a big deal out of the fact that everybody that enlisted in that company was going to get a nice, bright, shiny uniform, and a brand new musket, and a cartouche bag. And this uniform is described in a number of different publications from that time period. This is the original muster roll for the first regiment that was enrolled in Pennsylvania to fight out, to launch an offensive into Fort Duquesne under General Forbes, the second commander that came over. And David Paisley was the very first one to enlist. The dates, May 1st, 2nd, so you can see, I mean, he's not number one just because they wanted to put him as number one. He was number one because he was the first one to sign on the dotted line. His captain was Captain Robert Eastburn. You remember the original map that I showed when I started popping in the different cabins? One of those was Eastburn. It was John Eastburn. His brother was Robert Eastburn. So undoubtedly, Robert Eastburn, by the way, had gone off on a trading mission, been captured by the French and Indians and imprisoned back in 1756 and 57, and he escaped and made his way back to Philadelphia. That's why he was one of the first ones to sign up as a captain. But you can be assured that when he came home and was talking to his brother about his exploits and what he was going to do, that all the young men in the community were getting all riled up too, which is why David Paisley, who happens to be the only one from the Norriton area that signed up in this company, signed up right away. He had to go to Philadelphia to sign up. It shows here on his enrollment, his occupation was a cooper. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall. He was born in White Marsh. White Marsh is where Archibald McLean lived, near Abington Presbyterian Church. So we know we got the right guy. He signed up on May 1st. Excuse me. He was 19 at the time, which jives with the date of his baptism. And he's described as full-faced. So his enlistment was through the end of the year. This is the path that he took. He came from Philadelphia. They marched. They didn't yet have their uniforms. They did have guns. They marched to Harris Ferry. They marched up the Susquehanna to Fort Augusta. By now, half the company was sick. So, and also most of the people in the company were much older than David Paisley. So half the company was left in Fort Augusta just to defend the fort. The able-bodied men would continue on in the expedition because they had to build a road across and through the mountains to carry all the artillery out to lay siege to Fort Duquesne. Came back down the Susquehanna, went through Carlisle, and ended up Fort Bedford, there we go, where the troops were all organized, they were given uniforms, they were trained and drilled and everything. Then they started building a road. He was on the road crew that built Forbes Road out to Fort Ligonier, where they built another fort. From there, they launched a surprise attack on Fort Duquesne, which was a failure. The French retaliated and attacked Fort Ligonier. There was a tremendous battle there. David Paisley was in the battle. They successfully defended the fort. The French and the Indians retired. The Indians said, okay, we've had enough this year, we're going hunting. They all split. The French went back to the fort. There weren't enough of them to really defend the fort. Meanwhile, back in Philadelphia, diplomatic relations had occurred with the Indian tribes, and they had reached a treaty with the Indians that the Indians were no longer going to participate on the side of the French. So the French garrison at Fort Duquesne had no allies, and they didn't have enough men to man the fort. And so in the dead of night, they blew the place up, just as the last offensive was waged from Fort Ligonier by General Forbes to take Fort Duquesne. So they arrived, the smoldering ruins. They built Fort Pitt next to it, which ultimately became Pittsburgh. In December 1758, the company was discharged. This is his discharge paper. David Paisley, soldier, Captain Eastburn, 10 pounds, 6 shillings, discharged 19th December 1758. On the back, he signed it because this was like a note. The Provincial Assembly didn't have the cash to pay him. They didn't really have cash in those days. So they gave him a note. When you turned the note in to get gold later, when it was available, you had to sign it just like a check. You have to endorse your check. When David Paisley signed this, on the back he wrote David Paisley, Sergeant. The final muster in December 17th, before the discharge occurred, showed that there were no superior officers in the company. It was all privates. So he effectively was in control of the company at the time that it was discharged. He re-enlisted in 1759, served the entire year of 1759, but by then there was really nothing to do. The Indians were all off back in the woods hunting. The French had all retreated back up into Canada. Fort Duquesne had been destroyed. Fort Pitt was being built. He was probably in the regiment that went back out to Fort Pitt and rebuilt and built Fort Pitt. At the end of the year, he was discharged. But this time, notice, he was an ensign, which is the next rank below a lieutenant. It's between sergeant and lieutenant. This is a commissioned office, which gave him the right to a land warrant of 2,000 acres, which I've been unable to find any record of him ever claiming it. He probably sold it, which was typical in those days. If you didn't want to move onto the land yourself, you'd sell your right to somebody, a head right, and that's most likely what he did. And then he moved to Baltimore. He got married to his master cooper's daughter, tried farming in Norriton, went down to Baltimore. He was a cooper in Baltimore. There was a big shipping industry going on there. It was a real boom town, actually, even more than Philadelphia. And then in 1772, there was a credit crisis, and Baltimore completely shut down their economy. It was just destroyed because all of Baltimore shipping went to England. Not so in Philadelphia. And so on the other side of the Delmarva Peninsula in Delaware, there was Duck Creek, and there was a shipping industry there, and they were taking the produce from Delaware and the eastern shore of Maryland and shipping it up the Delaware River to Philadelphia. So he moved there and probably continued in his cooper trade. And then in 1776, Delaware, which at that time was still part of Pennsylvania. Remember, William Penn had acquired it in 1704. They answered Congress's call after the Bunker Hill in Boston. George Washington was sent to Massachusetts to command the army. They didn't have an army, it was all militia, so Congress issued a call to all of the states, send us each a regiment or two. Delaware for Pennsylvania sent the 1st Delaware Regiment. This was one of the first companies. Once again, he was the first guy out there. Once again, it's because they had these beautiful uniforms. They were known as the Delaware Blues. And again, just like with the other one, that was a big thing. It's in all the stuff you read about this company was how they were attracted by the uniforms, you know, it was a real show for the ladies and all that kind of thing. And so, he enlisted in 1776 in the first Delaware Regiment of the Continental Army. And he was at the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Fort Washington, Harlem Heights, and his company was one of several companies that basically held the line while the rest of the army retreated, as Washington retreated up north into upper New York and then across the Hudson River into New Jersey. Ultimately down to Princeton, where his time ran out and he was discharged and left. Second Delaware came and they were the ones that ended up at Guilford Courthouse about. So, then David, after he was discharged the third time, went back home to what was then in Delaware, lived there for another year, and then moved back across the Chesapeake to Baltimore again, still as a cooper, went up the Patapsco River, and I lost track of him in 1784. I did discover, though, that he had a son and two daughters, and the son ended up serving in the War of 1812 and was killed in Canada at Niagara, the Battle of Niagara. And his children were then all orphaned and sent off to apprentice in different trades, and I lost track of them at that point. And that's all I know about that. So, to be continued, my intention is to pick up in North Carolina and work my way through until at least my branch of the family went off to Tennessee and Kentucky. But I think we've got most of them accounted for. One thing that I've discovered in doing all this research is every time I think that I've got everything all figured out, I find the very last piece of evidence or scrap of anything. Somebody, normally Diane, will call me and say, look what I found! And then I have to rewrite the whole thing all over. Anyway, thanks for listening.
If everybody could kind of gather up at the front and get a picture, we always get a picture of the Paisleys. So if everybody could just kind of walk up there, maybe push the TV back a little bit. Thank you, Amanda.
No, it's the same force.